Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a
The FCC Space Bureau plays a key role in advancing the Commission's space innovation agenda to meet the needs of the next generation space age. The Bureau promotes a competitive and innovative global communications marketplace by leading policy and licensing matters related to satellite and space-based communications and activities. The Space Bureau also serves as the FCC's focal point for coordination with other U.S. government agencies on matters of space policy and governance, and collaborates with the Office of International Affairs for consultation with other countries, international and multilateral organizations, and foreign government officials that involve satellite and space policy matters. My guest on this edition of the Journal of Space Commerce podcast is Space Bureau Chief Jay Schwartz. And Jay, thank you very much for being my guest on the program.
Hey, thanks, Tom. Glad to be here.
Let's start out and just talk about the Space Bureau itself. A lot of people may not realize that there hasn't been a Space Bureau for as long as the U.S. government has been involved in space. It was established in 2022. So give me some idea about the original mandate and how that mission may have changed over time.
Yeah, so as you said, actually it was 2023, I believe. April 2023 is when the FCC Space Bureau, just about 3 years ago, was formed out of the International Bureau at the time. So the FCC has been involved in space work for decades, but really the recognition of the importance of space activities, particularly with respect to communications, that we've all been seeing in the industry in the last few years, that recognition led to the FCC, creating the Space Bureau for a dedicated focus on this part of the industry. Now, to your question about how things have changed or how the mandate has changed, I think the way I would describe it is the volume and complexity has changed significantly in terms of what the FCC through the Space Bureau has had to deal with, and that's happened as the changes in the industry, which you're documenting week in, week out, as those changes in the industry are having an effect on the licensing activity. So just to give you a sense of that, I looked at our data from the last decade, and the number of applications that we've received for licensing space has increased about 217%, okay, over that decade. So more than double. But I think that actually understates a little bit of what we're seeing, because at the same time, there's also been a significant change in the types of applications in terms of the complexity that we've gotten. So a decade ago, about 80% of the applications were geostationary applications, relatively straightforward to license. And typically you're dealing with just one satellite, right? What we're seeing today is we're seeing that flipped, and something on the order of about 80% are your NGSO or your LEO constellations. So more complex, larger, obviously in terms of the number of satellites, more complex interference environments. And then actually we're also getting a number of things, we might touch on this a little bit later, that don't even fall into that traditional NGSO or GSO category. So we've licensed a few commercial lunar missions, for instance, and I think we'll continue to see more and more of those type of emerging space activities. So that's how I think that's why they created the Space Bureau, but then it's really meant that we've needed to scale our operations in Space Bureau to match what's going on in the industry, so that we can provide the speed and the predictability that is really necessary, we believe, to ensuring that the commercial space economy can continue to grow.
But there are a lot of agencies that, think about the FAA, there's the Department of War, the Department of State. They're all involved in one way or another in space licensing. So how does the Space Bureau fit in, and do you actually all talk to one another?
Yeah, great question. So we do all talk to each other. Let me give you a little bit of a mapping on some of the major regulatory players. So the FAA handles launch and reentry. Commerce licenses for remote sensing. Commerce and state both have a role in sort of export controls. When we get to the FCC is really here for the spectrum management dimension of it. And so we are the licensing commercial operations using the spectrum. That then means that we ultimately end up working through an organization called NTIA, National Telecommunications Information Administration at Department of Commerce. We work through NTIA on that coordination of the spectrum with federal users. So you mentioned DOW, for instance, NASA, others that also use spectrum for federal operations. The Space Bureau and the FCC work through NTIA on that coordination process. But our real focus is on licensing use of the spectrum for these commercial space operations.
Let's talk about spectrum for a minute, because spectrum is finite. I think everybody knows that there's only so much spectrum out there, and the demand for it doesn't seem to be finite. So let's talk about spectrum allocation as it relates to the mega constellations that are becoming more the norm. And this is something, as we were talking before we got started here, back when I was studying broadcast communications in college, the FCC had a mandate for licensing things that were in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. That was a phrase that was drummed into our heads. Is there still some of that DNA in what you're doing in licensing spectrum for space?
Yeah, absolutely. So that same terminology and phrase is still in the statute and still guides us, and you'll see that pop up in a lot of Space Bureau's work. To your question about spectrum, absolutely, there is enormous demand for spectrum, and we see, these. You mentioned the larger constellations, the larger LEO constellations, but there's other space stuff that's not even that. We see, the enormous demand that's coming really being as a result of the enormous prosperity that can be promised by a lot of these activities. So already you're seeing, rural broadband being extended in the United States, to real benefit to families that have never been connected at the sort of speeds that you can realize. You're seeing connectivity on airplanes, right, at 300 megabits per second now. And then I think, you also have the direct to device or direct to cell. So already consumers are seeing this. We're seeing, there's Super Bowl commercials advertising this. So we really see this enormous demand for spectrum being because there's this demand in the consumer market that we're already getting delivered. Now, you mentioned broadcast. There is this progression that has been rolling for decades in terms of spectrum management at the FCC. So, back decades and decades ago, it was things like broadcast and making spectrum available for broadcast and for things like taxis to communicate with each other. And then we got the mobile revolution, right? And you have mobile and you have unlicensed spectrum for Wi-Fi and so forth. And so throughout that whole process, the FCC was changing spectrum allocations as the technologies and the things that consumers wanted to do with those technologies evolved. And so I think this is just the next iteration in a lot of technological developments that have meant that we now see that space is a real opportunity to deliver those things for consumers and consumers and businesses. And so we are working very hard on figuring out how we can make sure that there is enough available spectrum for these activities so that they can deliver more, better broadband, better other types of connectivity. So to that point, we do have a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. We call it the Spectrum Abundance Rulemaking, and we're proposing four new allocations on, so essentially four new bands. If I can remember correctly, it's upper 12, 41 gigahertz, 42 gigahertz band, and then something that's called the W band, which is actually several little ones above 95 gigahertz. And so these are new bands. It's over 20,000 megahertz that we've proposed that we're hoping to open up. And we've been seeking comment on it because we do think that this will really enable more of these more of these space activities, which now are really starting to kind of hit their stride.
Along those lines, Jay, the FCC is, at the end of the day, a regulatory agency. And so how do you make sure that the rules that you're creating keep pace with the scale of the deployments that you're seeing and the rapidly changing technology?
Yeah, it's a really hard problem. And it's something that I think most regulators probably, particularly in rapidly changing technological fields, deal with. There is a kind of persistent problem. I think that the FCC has done this in many cases of where we would hardwire into our rules, particular technologies or particular ways of doing things, and that may be to some extent unavoidable, but it can create a problem because the rules that we have on the books are just constantly lagging and could be many decades even behind the state of the art with the technology. And then, because there's a lot of international components to space regulation, some of those outdated technical rules end up in the international regulation. So it doesn't just create a problem domestically, but it can create a problem globally. So something we are trying to do, and this is sort of a conceptual framework, is conceptually trying to put in place frameworks where the frameworks allow for that adjustment and updating of technology. And so, the devil is of course in the details, but maybe one way to think about that is you could regulate inputs or you could regulate outputs. So you could try to say we want to say what overall level of interference might be allowable, or some metric that matters for the consumer at the end of the day, or we could regulate some input and that might be specific to a particular technology, for instance. And I think if you do that latter case, you probably risk more becoming outdated. Whereas if you're saying this is the top level thing that we want, that we know that technology is going to get better, spectrum sharing technologies are going to get better, antennas are going to get better. Hopefully, over time, the incentives can be aligned for companies to be able to do more and still hit that sort of top level thing we're trying to achieve, but it allows for that evolution of the technology. I think the other thing is you start setting up frameworks like this, and you open the door for better opportunities for private negotiation. So you never want a situation where we've put a regulation in place, and that has the effect of preventing a beneficial gain from private negotiation between two parties, that otherwise would be unobjectionable but for that rule. And so I think, again, if we want to put in place frameworks that can allow for that evolution, and I think in general allow for private negotiation to try to achieve better outcomes overall. So that's very abstract and high level, but I do think you're right. I think you've touched on something of how we are trying to figure out different frameworks so we're not constantly locked in this, the rules being, years or decades behind the state of the art, because we have extremely rapid cycles here in this industry, right? That's one of the things that we all are seeing is, the commercial industry is rapidly innovating. And so we don't want to be the bottleneck to that rapid innovation.
So when everybody's cell phone essentially becomes a satellite communications device, because mostly they are already, if you've got a reasonably new cell phone. I know that when I'm out of range, the little satellite icon shows up on my phone that says I can at least get an emergency message out. What is the impact of that, of millions and millions and millions of basically satellite communications devices everywhere, pretty much in the world?
Yeah, so let me answer that from sort of a real world point of view, near term. And I have various emails that talk about how actual people's lives have been saved from this direct to cell technology, right? So we hear fairly frequently of someone who's out on a hiking trip and was able to send that critical text that literally saved their lives. So we're already seeing that real world effect in a very meaningful way of kind of the reduction of these dead zones and so forth. I think much longer, in the longer term, this is again that natural evolution that we've seen for decades in this industry of greater convergence, right? Greater convergence of networks. And so you have, we've seen the wireless wireline convergence in terrestrial networks. You now don't really have to think about whether, okay, my cell phone is talking to a mobile network, or I walk into my house and now it's talking to my Wi-Fi network. And so you kind of have this extension of, at some point you go out of a zone where you're talking to a mobile tower, and then you're talking to a satellite, right? And so I think that convergence is normal. I think it's TBD on exactly how it all pans out in terms of the economics and the business models. I think one of the great things that we're seeing, and that we've really tried to make sure is possible, is enabling different people to try different business models and different technologies to deliver direct to device, right? So we're big believers in the opportunity here, and I think there's a lot of vibrant commercial activity that's going on out there. You read it every day in the headlines, and so long term, I could see this being just another extension of this sort of ubiquitous global network connecting everyone everywhere.
One thing more before we turn the corner. Not too long ago, the FCC got involved in orbital debris mitigation and established rules for when satellites need to be deorbited. Why is that the charge of the Federal Communications Commission?
Yeah, great question. So one way to think about what the FCC is doing is we have a statutory mandate to make communication services by wire radio available to the American public. And so, as part of licensing spacecraft and space activity, and that hook on the radio frequency, but it actually the statute talks about an apparatus as well. So which is transmitting over the radio frequency. And so you kind of take that, and you take the importance of making communication services available, and what you end up with is I think an understanding that we want to make sure that there is some reasonable space safety of our among our licensees, because it would not be promoting greater communication services if there's a particularly unsafe environment with a lot of collisions and communication satellites colliding or becoming dangerous debris that isn't taken care of. And so it's actually the FCC's had these rules since 2004. So this isn't a new thing. The FCC's had various space safety and orbital debris rules since then. And so we do think that having some basic things like a spacecraft which is using RF would engage in collision avoidance, that they would be identifiable. We think that all those sort of feed into and really hook into our statutory mandate to promote communications. I will distinguish that from getting more involved in sort of the activities that are actually being conducted. So I know we'll talk about some of those activities maybe in a minute, but I do think that we want to focus on what I just described in terms of that level of safety, and not the FCC jumping into regulation of things that you might be doing on that spacecraft, whether it's I'll use an example. Some companies are making pharmaceuticals in space. So you need a vehicle, and it needs to use the RF to go up into space. And so that's very much within the bounds of the FCC licensing. But I don't think it makes sense that we would then stretch into regulating the activity of that pharmaceutical that you're making. That's outside the bounds of the FCC's statutory limits.
Well, you gave me a good tease. I'm Tom Patton, and I'm talking with Jay Schwartz, Space Bureau Chief at the FCC. And when we come back, weird space stuff. Don't go anywhere.
You're listening to the Journal of Space Commerce podcast from Xterra Media. The Journal of Space Commerce is the only industry publication to offer in-depth coverage of the entire space commerce value chain, from the supply chain to satellite operations and terrestrial applications. If you're a decision maker or investor in the space commerce industry, or an executive who needs to know how space commerce touches your business, please consider becoming a paid subscriber. Of course, everyone is welcome. Your paid subscription will give you first access to premium articles and podcasts focused on the space value chain. From market analyses to regulatory developments and company spotlights, paid subscribers will find valuable data to help you make informed decisions. Just visit www.xterrajsc.com on Substack and help keep the Journal of Space Commerce the industry's only independent source for space commerce intelligence for business leaders.
Welcome back to the Journal of Space Commerce podcast. I'm Tom Patton, and I'm talking with FCC Space Bureau Chief Jay Schwartz. If you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Rumble, or any other podcast platform, don't forget to hit subscribe so that you don't miss any of our podcasts or other videos. Jay, the full commission just approved a notice of proposed rulemaking that would make additional spectrum available for certain unique spacecraft. It's been described as weird space stuff. And why does the FCC think this is necessary?
Yeah, let me try to make a little bit of sense of what weird space stuff and what's going on here. I'll step back and say that we believe that the infrastructure, the space infrastructure that is being built is really going to be fundamental to future prosperity. I think there's a lot of prosperity and safety that is downstream of building this space infrastructure, which we're in the process and seeing before our eyes building. But one thing that happens when you have an industry and particularly like a core infrastructure is you eventually start getting a broadening out in many ways of sort of ancillary activities and industries that go out from that. So if you think of in this situation, communications and maybe communications being the core thing we're talking about here in terms of space, but then there are lots of other things beyond just that communications infrastructure that people are starting to want to do. And so, for instance, we talk about servicing. So people might want to service a satellite. People might want to refuel a satellite. People are talking about, are there possibilities of assembling in space satellites so that you can get through, not have to reinforce when you're during launch, so many resources are used to strengthen things to just survive the launch, but then they're saying, could you manufacture in space? And so with kind of this comms layer of infrastructure that exists, we're now seeing that broadening out as is very typical and all the things when people want to do. A lot of it to service that infrastructure, but then eventually folks, or as we know, are going to do more human habitable vehicles, certainly, lunar expeditions and whatnot. And what's happening is these are now, unlike in the past, many of them are going to be commercially done. And so let me get to with that windup. Let me get to what weird space stuff is, because these activities, these missions, which are not delivering communication services, have and are commercial, have a very specific problem. They need to access spectrum for their TT&C, or their telemetry, tracking, and command function, so to guide the spacecraft, but they don't have a frequency band to do that in that is otherwise being used for communication. So a communication satellite has a frequency band that they have access to, and they're delivering the actual communication service over that, and they can do that TT&C in that band. Okay, that doesn't exist if you're not doing communication services. And so kind of where we got to weird space stuff is there's all these different things. It's ISAM, but it's more than ISAM. So we didn't want to just use something as narrow as that, whether it's lunar activities or other activities. And so we just started calling it weird space stuff because that kind of stuck as we were trying to figure out, we're looking for a nice business buttoned up name for it. And weird space stuff just sort of stuck. But really what it is these non-communications operations that need spectrum for their TT&C. And it's not that we haven't licensed things like this in the past, but the bands that are currently available tend to be also very busy in terms of federal users. And so from our desire to find new ways to get more access to spectrum for more commercial activities, this is really about trying to be creative and trying to come up with new spectrum, either new spectrum bands or new ways of using other bands, so that these weird space stuff can ultimately carry out their missions.
But a lot of the things that we all take for granted now, satellite communications being one of them, would have been considered weird not too long ago. When you talked about debris removal and refueling and in-space construction, I'm going to ask you to speculate just a little bit. Is the FCC kind of co-writing a new business model for the new space economy?
Yeah, so I think often about the Arthur C. Clarke. You made me think about the Arthur C. Clarke quote. I think they called it his third law, which was whatever any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. I've made the point that one of the things you see with technology is it very quickly goes from being magical to very mundane, right? As we just become used to it. So can you imagine the first time someone's house was electrified back in the 1920s or 1930s? It must have been magical, right? Well, can you imagine the first time you used a cell phone, right? Or a car phone, right? I mean, that's, we're all so comfortable with it now, but it really went very quickly from magical to mundane. Using very high speed internet at 37,000 feet is something that we're currently in the process of going from wow, this is amazing to it's just very typical.
Why isn't the airplane Wi-Fi working?
Right. and so I think this is a very common pattern of to your point. I actually gave a speech not too long ago where I was sort of talking a little bit about the weird space stuff, and I did make the point. I said, look, what is weird today is becoming mainstream, or what's weird today isn't weird tomorrow. It's becoming mainstream, and that's actually a sign of success of a technology, right? That's sign of success of an industry when it's actually hit orbital velocity or something like that, right? Escape velocity, and you're no longer weird, but it's just normal. And so we are, the weird space stuff was a little bit tongue in cheek, to be a little bit playful, but our hope is that this expanding space economy built around your sort of core comms infrastructure layer is going to be really valuable and bring a lot of prosperity in ways that we can't even imagine. So I often say I'm a Washington paper pusher, so I'm not the one trying to figure out, does this business plan make sense, or this business plan make sense, at least in my current role. But I hope that people will come up with those, and we want to just like provide the fuel in terms of the spectrum so that people can go and try and innovate.
We could have another whole long discussion about all the things that we saw in Star Trek that now we hold in our hands.
Totally.
So
totally.
It's just, and that kind of proves that third law. Let's talk a little bit more about this NPRM, though. Jay, how does it mesh with the Part 100 overhaul of the assembly line licensing proposal?
Yeah, great question. The assembly line, so we call it our Part 100 reform, and as you said, we are calling it. We're saying we want to build a licensing assembly line, and what this really is about is, right at the beginning, I talked about how we as a government, we as Space Bureau, need to scale our operations to match the speed and innovation cycles of what we're seeing in the industry. So we got to reflect that in government. And so the licensing assembly line is meant to do that, to provide greater speed, greater predictability, and greater flexibility for the industry so that they can get their licenses. We can still do our regulatory duties, but we can do it in a much faster and efficient way. And so that's the Part 100 licensing assembly line. the weird space stuff is kind of another piece on this innovation agenda of making sure there's enough spectrum. Now, where they come together is we did propose in our licensing assembly line something which we call a VTSS, or a variable trajectory spacecraft system. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to recognize that as these new activities that we've been talking about in this call, as these new activities get out there, we need to make sure that there's a way to license them clearly. So the FCC, the Space Bureau, had rules for how do you license a GSO, how do you license a traditional NGSO, but then it was kind of a square peg round hole situation for some of these other things. For instance, suppose a mission that's going to be operating at a bunch of different geo locations because it's going to be moving around, or extending the life of various geos, or moving them around. Or what if about something that's going to be operating at a whole bunch of different altitudes at a very variable over the life of the mission and the license. And so I think about whenever we're licensing something, I think about there being kind of two key components. There's the orbital component. So that would be kind of where in physical space is the spacecraft or spacecrafts located, altitudes, inclinations, all those sorts of things. And so there you kind of have GSO, you have NGSO, and then we're proposing this new one called VTSS, Variable Trajectory Spacecraft System. The idea being that it doesn't fit into those other two buckets. It could be going to an asteroid. It could be going to the moon. It could be moving around, much more variable, to a bunch of different other spacecrafts to service them. So that's kind of the orbital dimension. And then the next dimension, the other key dimension, is the spectrum. And so that's where we're dealing with making sure that there's enough spectrum for these operations. So if you're a VTSS and you're not doing communications, then hopefully through the weird space stuff proceeding, we'll be able to get you some spectrum. But that's kind of how they marry together. But they're both working together, and you've hit on this, I think perceptively. They're both working together to facilitate this new portion of the space economy. And then we have other proceedings to make sure we can license, NGSO constellations that are delivering rural broadband. That we can do that. We can do the licensing quickly and efficiently, and that we also can make sure there's plenty of spectrum. So I'd say across the board, licensing efficiency, more spectrum is kind of the key play that we've been running.
One of the other things that the FCC has always traditionally been involved in is interference. And I'm thinking that you're a U.S. government regulatory agency, and yet satellites are not bound by national boundaries. How much coordination is there between yourself and your counterparts in Europe and Asia Pacific and other places where they're also building satellites and need that spectrum?
Yeah, so look, there's an enormous amount of coordination, both government to government in many cases, and also through the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, which is maybe the formal place for that. I will mention, so the World Radio Conference in 2027, 80% of the agenda items are space related. So it's going to be a really important conference, and it's one that the U.S. government's preparing for. But it's going to be a real key one for the space economy, and that's sort of that every 4 years opportunity to work on these spectrum issues and harmonization internationally. And then there's sort of constant coordination between specific systems for exactly the reason that you say, that these are ultimately international. They're not just staying over one country.
Let's talk about the timeline very briefly about the NPRM, because I know it's out for comments now. And I also know from my long experience in the aviation world that that's not a short process. So what kind of timeline are you looking for? Do you think there will be pushback from the industry, or is this something that the space community has been asking for?
Yeah, sure. So let's just handle timeline first. So the commission adopted the item last week. So I think we're recording on a Tuesday, right? And so last Thursday is when the commission adopted it. It was a unanimous bipartisan vote, which is always wonderful to see. And So we will get it published in the Federal Register, and then that's actually when the official comment window will open. So the public will have an opportunity to give their feedback. We find these comments very helpful. We do not think that we're the fount of all knowledge when we make a proposal, and so these thoughtful comments really can improve the final outcome. And so then we just got over the finish line on the NPRM, but I think what you would expect is, we'll need a number of months. As you said, it takes time to receive the comments, to sort through them, go through the decision-making process. But I will say the chairman is very focused on boosting the space economy. And so I think that, he's very interested in anything we can do to again, provide spectrum in this case, which is what this item's about, to boost it.
Jay, thank you very much. It's been a very interesting conversation, and I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks, Tom.
Jay Schwartz is the FCC Space Bureau Chief. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Journal of Space Commerce podcast. I'm Tom Patton. Thanks for joining us.
The Journal of Space Commerce podcast is a production of Xterra Media. The executive producers are Mike Turner and Tom Patton, with production assistance from Debbie Turner. You can subscribe to the audio version of the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Audible, and many other popular podcasting platforms. Be sure to click subscribe so that you don't miss any of our podcasts or any of our other videos. The Journal of Space Commerce is the only industry publication systematically covering the entire space commerce value chain, from the supply chain to satellite operations and terrestrial applications. If you're a decision maker or investor in the space commerce industry, or an executive who needs to know how space commerce touches your business, please consider becoming a paid subscriber. Of course, everyone is welcome. Your paid subscription will give you first access to premium articles and podcasts focused on the space value chain. From market analyses to regulatory developments and company spotlights, paid subscribers will find valuable data to help you make informed decisions. Just visit www.xterrajsc.com on Substack and help keep the Journal of Space Commerce the industry's only independent source for space commerce intelligence for business leaders.